So hi, everyone. Thank you so much for tuning in to the third and final part of the series titled What We Imagine in Its Absence, presented by the Los Angeles Film Forum. For those who may not be familiar, Los Angeles Film Forum was founded in 1975 and is the longest running organization in Southern California dedicated exclusively to the ongoing non-commercial exhibition of independent, experimental, and progressive media art. If you'd like to know more about the organization and this particular program and others, please visit lafilmforum.org. I'm Leeroy Kang, and I am the programmer of the series. And I just really couldn't be happier than to be here today with the two artists and filmmakers that I've featured in the series, Vika Kirchenbauer, who is joining us from Berlin, and Caroline Key, who is actually joining us from Los Angeles. We got a little lucky with that because she is usually based in Brooklyn, New York. I just wanted to mention that this conversation is being pre-recorded. So today is April 10th. And while we would have loved to be live with all of you as a part of this conversation, we are recording this ahead of schedule as a way to accommodate our different time zone differences and as well as our individual schedules. And so, we really conceived of this conversation today, not as like a formal Q&A or an exchange that would just exist between myself as the programmer and Caroline and Vika as the artists, but we really wanted to use this space as kind of an open forum for engagement and discussion with each other. And of course, we will be thinking of all of you as our imaginary audience that we hope will reach you in the future when this program goes online. Before we jump into the conversation, I wanted to share some kind of general information about the program series and the works, as well as a way to just sort of ground the conversation and to contextualize it as well. Particularly for those who may not have been able to watch both programs of Vika and Caroline's work, or either of them for that matter, and just was interested in tuning into the conversation part of it. So as a way to do that, I'm going to just sort of read aloud the introduction to my program notes for the series, and to share a little bit about Vika and Caroline's works as well. I encourage everyone to visit the Film Forum website to be able to have access to the full program notes as well as Caroline and Vika's bios. So in order to know something, must we be able to see it? If not, then how do we come to know what refuses visibility? What is imagined in what we cannot see? This three-part program series explores these questions by engaging with the works of two artists and filmmakers, Vika Kirchenbauer and Caroline Key. Within their respective practices, these artists meditate on conditions of alterity and constructions of otherness by exploring opacity as a mode of formal, conceptual, and aesthetic address. Rather than prioritizing notions of transparency and the insistence of visual representation as a central means of capture, Kirchenbauer and Key instead call attention to the gaps, traces, and peripheries of the subjects within their works. Through utilizing forms of experimental nonfiction, essay, translation, and performance, the artists' works in the series reflect on the conditions of medicalized, institutional, and state violence, and its material and affective impacts on subjects marked by racialized, gendered, classed, and sexual difference. They allow us to consider what remains unknowable, invisible, or unremembered within the limitations of the image and its production. And by doing so, they reveal what often lies in plain sight, reorienting us to other registers of perception, speculation, and impossibility. So the first program featured 5 works by Berlin-based filmmaker, artist, writer, and music producer Vika Kirchenbauer, including the Los Angeles virtual premiere of her new short film, Untitled Sequence of Gaps, which recently was awarded the German Film Critics Award for Best Experimental Film in 2020, offering a glimpse into Kirchenbauer's wide-ranging practice. These works are interconnected through their complex negotiations of visibility as they relate to ideas of personal and collective memory and non-remembrance, politics of spectatorship, and the performative gestures by which difference is codified. The second program featured 2 works by Brooklyn-based filmmaker and artist Caroline Key, including her feature experimental documentary Grace Period from 2015, which was co-directed by Kim Kyung-mook, and the Los Angeles virtual premiere of her new short film Cora from 2019. As part of Key's ongoing interest in examining conditions and formations of alterity, these works are brought together in their various political and aesthetic expressions of refusal through a range of cinematic practices, including documentary nonfiction, experimental video, animation, and digital graphics. Within the space of refusal, issues of body sovereignty, gendered and sexualized labor, and economic precarity are brought to the fore as she negotiates what is both revealed and withheld within the frame. So that's just some general information to kind of ground our conversation today about the program and each of Caroline and Vika's works and practices. And, so I think that we can go ahead and shift into the conversation between us. And, I wanted to kind of open it up by sharing like a general reflection for myself, which is that, last week we had a meet and greet. So allowing Vika and Caroline to meet for the first time. And it was really wonderful. And something that I realized in that was that I had met both of you in the same year in 2015 while I was living in New York, and realizing that it was really my first encounters with your work that sort of led me to being able to meet both of you, and also our building upon our friendships over the years. And so with that, I was originally sort of conceiving of maybe 2 separate programs, sort of standalone programs, kind of focused on both of your works. And within the last year, I was really thinking about this idea of what it would mean or what it would look like to bring both of you together. Something, Vika, that you had mentioned to me was that while the pandemic has sort of, in all of its many atrocities, it's also kind of allowed for new modes of access as well to programs and works and to each other in many ways, to be in conversation like today from various parts of the world. And but one thing you mentioned was that you really missed meeting strangers and the sort of chance encounter of connection. And so in that spirit, I kind of wanted to open it up to both of you to share any reflections or thoughts about what it has been like to, to meet each other in this kind of space and to engage with each other's work for the first time.
Do you want to start, Caroline? Should I?
Hi, Vika, again, and
Hey.
and imaginary audience. I guess I do want to kind of shift away just a touch to say, like, thank you, Leeroy, for like initiating this, for like being the catalyst for like actually bringing us together. And I think that is something that for me I hold very dearly, is that it's through you, it's through a relationship that I have a lot of trust and respect and admiration within. And so like, I don't like meeting strangers. Like, I have a lot of anxiety around it. And so like, I love meeting new people, but I love meeting new people as like an extension of like the community and the network and like the like people I love, right? The people who like, whose values I share, right? Whose perspective I share, and like who are always like expanding upon like what I already know. And so I feel like in a way, this is an introduction to somebody new, but it's also sort of just kind of broadening the life that I want to cultivate, right? Like with the people I want to cultivate.
Yeah, I feel similarly. Thanks, Leeroy, and for bringing us together, for bringing us into conversation amongst the 2 of us, but also with you. And I think, it's true that I miss kind of public life and public space and being in conversation with strangers, but this is very much not a chance encounter. And this is also a way of wanting to honor and highlight the work you put into this, because it's been so nice as a process and so beautiful to see how much care and love and thought and insight you put into the communication and into facilitating a space where we can meet, albeit across time zones and different locations. And after getting to know Caroline's work, I think it is rather obvious that we do share some concerns, and I very much understand why you brought the two of us together.
One thing to add, and this is just like, I think I was a little surprised, Leeroy, to hear that like you had met me, and you had met Vika at the same time. And I think just thinking about like meeting strangers, I always assume I'm the stranger in a situation. And I think that's also how I approach my work. But I was like, I always assume that conditions and histories and relationships precede my encounter with them, right? So I think I assume that you and Vika had known each other much longer than like you and I have known each other, right? Or that like, that I always just kind of feel like I'm trying to figure out and orient myself in a situation that everybody else already knows sort of the rules for or have an understanding of. And so I don't know how that relates, but that was just a random thought that came to my mind just now.
Yeah, I mean, I just want to respond to a couple of things that both of you mentioned. And I love what you just said, Caroline, about that, about kind of assuming yourself as the stranger in multiple kind of like, you know, socially, but also within your work. And I think that really actually does make a lot of sense. But, you know, it goes without saying like how happy and honored I feel to be bringing you both together and to be able to engage with your works as, you know, as artists and also as people who have been so instrumental in my own thinking about work and what it means to produce and to program and to produce scholarship and creative kind of convenings, you know, around these different topics. And so I want to thank you both for that very much. But yeah, I think that we could take this conversation in many different directions, and I by no means want to or feel that I should lead it, or you know, but I'm happy to also if both of you want. But yeah, I think that we could maybe even talk a little bit about things that I think is even maybe related, Caroline, to what you just kind of brought up about the stranger. And you know, one thing that I wanted to really talk about is the subject of opacity, right? That really grounds so much of both of your practices and your works, and in so many different ways. And I find this to be so incredible. How, you know, I should kind of say that it's kind of manifold, right? The ways that opacity, I think, emerges in your work, like not just sort of from a conceptual theoretical framework, but also very much that's embedded in the aesthetics and the formal sort of execution of the works themselves. And so, you know, it would be very remiss to not talk about this, the influence of the French Caribbean writer and philosopher Edward Glissant, who I know is very much an inspiration and influence on both of your works and also of my own thinking. And, you know, for those who may not be as familiar with Glissant's work, you know, it's really these ideas of opacity are being addressed in his text titled Poetics of Relation that was published in 1990. And, you know, it's really looking at these ideas of relation from a post-colonial type of framework, right, of this claim to have the right to opacity. And what that really is saying is, you know, Glissant is talking about, you know, the demand that the colonizer has of the colonized for transparency and to be fully understood. And as in that kind of process, you know, really flattening the individual into a singular identity or mode of being. That's obviously very much within a very westernized kind of rubric of understanding relation and power. And so I'm really struck by how Glissant's work, I feel, is being taken up, I feel, in more recent years from many different scholars and artists, and many particularly scholars of color who are really, addressing Glissant's framework of opacity in a lot of what's happening ongoing, right? And within the sort of neoliberal kind of space that we exist in around how we measure and define and identify difference and these ideas of the other. And I feel like these are things that you both are really addressing in your works very much, and also imploring what I was saying about the aesthetics and the formal devices as well within the works from that kind of theoretical framework. So I was wondering if you guys could maybe share a little bit about that and your relationship to that text, and also just that opacity as a sort of mode in which you both are working in.
I came across Edouard Glissant's thinking around opacity around the time when I was working on Like Rights Leaving Sinking Ship that I released in 2012, but I was working on in 2011. And I grew very fond of Glissant's thinking, and I find his concepts very, very helpful to thinking about a variety of things. But as you pointed out so clearly, the thoughts of Edouard Glissant, where they emerge and what they reflect, as a colonial and post-colonial context. So I think there are many, many concepts of his that I think are problematic to apply and translate to other fields. And especially if it's done by white people, like when, for example, of the creolization, that from the subject position of Edouard Glissant is brilliant, non-essentialist thinking. But if it is kind of argued by white people, it kind of can lead to justifying cultural appropriation, for example. So that's problematic. And just to say that I use Glissant's thinking quite carefully and those terms, because it can be problematic not to do this very carefully. And what I find important is that Glissant really points to like a kind of a deeper structure, or like an underlying pattern, that is the violence of transparency. And I think it is obviously not a coincidence that he's looking for like a deeper pattern and structure. And I think this is a pattern and structure that can be found in many, many different examples and instances of societal formations and issues. So as I was working on Like Rights Leaving Sinking Ship, I was receiving those psychological assessments that would kind of like legitimize or delegitimize my gender in a medical and legal way. So those were like psychiatric reports or assessments that kind of made me transparent, that tried to look for like a coherent biography. Of course, to get what I wanted, which was like legal and medical recognition, I had to place myself at the bottom of this hierarchy. And I think what Glissant means by the violence of transparency, or the right not to be understood, is actually, he demands the right to opacity, the right not to be understood, because those marginalized don't have that right. The right to opacity is usually reserved to those who don't need to explain themselves, who don't need to disclose. So by kind of demanding that right, it is demanding a right that people don't necessarily have in a colonial context, in a post-colonial context. If they're seeking asylum, if they're receiving welfare, they're made transparent and the state can look at their accounts. But if someone is paying taxes or avoiding or evading taxes, it's very difficult for the state to have access to someone's bank account. So there are a lot of like different instances where the right to opacity can clearly be seen to be reserved to those in power. And and kind of like making transparency the condition to either legitimize or delegitimize somebody and their existence or permit them to existence is measuring someone, in Glissant's words, by one's own scale. And that, to me, felt, it very much spoke to me as I was kind of going through this legal and medical process that takes like 1.5, 2 years in Germany. And I really, it resonated with me, this violence of like, of making one transparent, of having to prove suffering and all of that. And I'm very curious what Caroline's thoughts on this are, because this is so present in your work, and especially in Grace Period. I think it's so respectful and so tactful and so, just so beautifully done, how you also technically found ways of having people be present on their own terms.
Thank you so much for, well, first off, for like so eloquently kind of parsing out like the parameters and difficulties around the idea of opacity, and also for your like really lovely words on Grace Period. Like a little like yourself, like I encountered Glissant's work while working on a project, and it was Grace Period. And I just to give a little context, like I was in Korea and was thinking about intimacy and privacy in Korea when there was this news event that of this group of sex workers in Korea that were protesting the crackdown on their spaces, on their brothel spaces. And so myself and my co-director, Kyung-mook, we went to Yeongdeunpo, the district where the film was shot, and we just started speaking to these women. And the women were incredibly gracious and generous, and like gave us their time and gave us permission to like spend time with them and document them. But they were also very hyper aware of being seen and being represented. Because of these protests, journalists would come in, reporters from international reporters, Korean reporters would come in, and they were very aware, hyper aware of like how they presented themselves, right? What was thought of them, how their images were read, and like also how they were trying to resist or counter that, like what narratives they needed to be heard, right? And also just how these institutions of media would twist things, would manipulate their intentions or their desire, and how the control of their image was taken away from them. And so when Kyung-mook and I were filming, we were thinking a lot about that slipperiness, that difficulty of working with images, of representation and media. And it was a film that took a long time. All my works take a long time. So it was like a 4-year process. And we had already come up with this idea of creating these silhouettes of the women's figures, right? As a way of like marking their presence without disclosing their identity, right? Which is something that was absolutely vital to the piece because of the precarity of these women, and also of like the nature of their work having to be hidden to survive, right? Having to be ultra visible and sexually desirable, but at the same time having to not have their names disclosed, not being outed to their family, not being outed to their friends, not potentially being arrested or worse, right? Because of their positions. And so like the silhouette came about, and I didn't have a framework of talking about it. I thought of it purely in aesthetic formal terms. And it was only when I came to New York and I started having discussions with other people that somebody introduced me in a study group actually to the work of Glissant and the idea of right to opacity, and me thinking about my role as the filmmaker having this control over the image of these women, and how do I honor their generosity and their trust? And thinking about Glissant, thinking about, again, kind of going back to the idea that I always assume that conditions precede me, and like Glissant was proof of that, was evidence of that, was that I had a heavy responsibility. My partner and I had heavy responsibilities to our subjects and to this sort of history of representation. And it was sort of beautifully laid out within Glissant's work about like what the violence of transparency is, what the expectations are of filmmakers, of audiences, of institutional knowledge, right? And like how we really had to do so much more work to like recognize and sort of pierce that if possible, if it's at all possible. I don't know if I was successful. I don't know if the film was successful in that route, but we try to make that production really, really like that to be the most visible aspect of it, in addition to like the information that the women want to portray about themselves, right? We're very like specific in terms of like showing their lineage to like workers' movements, to thinking about gender, to the conditions of their work. Vika, I was also thinking about like how your work is so exemplary in that respect of like, but like also kind of moves forward in a way where I think there's a lot of discourse about opacity, and there's a lot of discourse about like withholding information formally as a formal tactic, right? I think that there's been a lot of artist work that have done that successfully and sometimes inconsiderately. And I was really struck in your work with how you use excessive visuality as a mode of opacity, right? Like you show so much that it becomes really clear what we can't know, right? We can't see and what we can't presume, right? So I was thinking about like the use of infrared and ultraviolet technology, and like how this is, like those were like military applications, as you've like so aptly point out, like to show what cannot be seen, to like really kind of push at the boundaries of visuality. But in seeing that, we can't see the touch necessarily. Like we don't actually know the touch. We don't know the conditions of that touch. We don't know the conditions of that presence. And I feel like it's using the technology against itself, which I really admire and am a little jealous of, because I think it's so beautifully done.
Yeah, I think I'm very interested in kind of unmet gazes and in this desire of like unilateral staring, and like and I think this is a very like Western condition of wanting to see more, of having like access to everything, of being like as close as possible, like being able to move into somebody else's skin without the risk of getting stuck in it, like this kind of experiential gain that, let's say, a mainstream spectator finds in their encounters with otherness or in encounters with difference. I think that's something I think is very symptomatic for certain types of subject positions and their political representations of like this kind of the normalcy of like being able to look, the normalcy of being able to experience difference without having to compromise one's own position. And to come back to Grace period, which when I watched it was at a particularly interesting moment when I watched it, because like maybe a week or two ago, no, like 2 weeks ago, there was like a big scandal in German television and public television, public broadcasting, and in all kinds of newspapers, because there was a documentary on sex workers who do their work in small caravans outside of a small town. And that documentary film won a lot of awards, and it was shown on TV. In the end, it comes out that some of it was staged. It was like a very kind of like close encounter, like within the caravan as clients are there, and it's like very, very close. And it comes out that some of it was staged also with participants who were not made aware sufficiently that their image was going to be used in something that will be labeled as a documentary without making clear that it's a hybrid format or something. So when this came out, like suddenly, I'm not doing the whole discourse justice. I'm just like trying to reduce it to explain the context of discourse within which I then watched your film. And it was very interesting that so many German newspapers were suddenly discussing the ethics of documentary filmmaking. And it quickly became, which is interesting, and it came so much about like, can we use enactment in documentary film, which I don't believe was the issue. I think the issue was the people enacting certain things, not being aware how the images would be used. But I kind of felt like it doesn't really matter to me fundamentally if it's enacted or not, and who or like the details of it. It was like that closeness and that hunger for closeness and kind of a documentary film world that looks for like a camera that gets as intimate as possible. And it is like in a lot of the jury statements I read, like year after year, kind of accolades on like how people or a filmmaker learned or managed to get the trust of the protagonists and managed to get so intimately into their world. And I think that is the problem. Whether or not it's enacted or not, I think that kind of like wanting to be as intimate to then walk away with the material and do something with it. And the kind of the achievement being that one has managed to get really close to something that is usually not as accessible. Which I think is like a symptom of rape culture also, of like trying to get as intimate but then running like really similar. And then in that kind of discursive context, I saw your film and was so happy to see it because you approached it so differently and respected the boundaries. There was no attempt of like getting closer, like of making more transparent than the people you worked with were willing to provide you within them as like subjects with agency. And you show them as they like perform on stages, like they use theater and performance as a political tool. They talk to you, and it's like it was such a different approach. The integrity with which you produced it and executed it was so, yeah, really struck by that. So I'm curious to hear more from you, how that process was and like how you show the work and how does like the showing of that work also reflect the trust with the people, how did they react to it? Are you still in conversation? How is their political struggle? Where are they now? Like your film made me so curious about like what happened also after the film.
So just to before I forget, like I it's such a insightful, poignant point about the sort of language of intimacy and assumed intimacy and demand for closeness, and how much that is a language of conquest. It reflects rape culture. It reflects like the language of the colonizer. It's just it's so prevalent, right? And I was laughing a little bit and unintentionally when you were describing the news of it, because like there's this cultural amnesia where like all of a sudden there'd be this discourse of like the ethics of the documentary filmmaker, and it's as though like it's brand new, as though this is not something that is like always been the condition, but like suddenly we have to remember, and then suddenly we're questioning the authenticity of like the materials that were being gathered, and really like that observation about like how what's really underlying it is that assumed intimacy, the normalcy of that intimacy, right? And how like normalcy, to be normal is like the condition of power, right? Like because it assumes a universal, right? It assumes something that most of us actually have like very restricted access to, like very calculated or like very limited points of access to. As for grace period, I mean, there are a few moments that for me, when I reflect back on it, I think are as moments of extraordinary intimacy that I feel very grateful to. But like, I recognize that as, or we tried very hard to recognize that that was a moment. It was like a temporal moment of intimacy. So like the film ends with like, you can hear the co-director Kyung-wook and one of the sex workers, and they sing together, right? It's during the credits. And it's this sort of spontaneous moment of connection and intimacy that we weren't expecting, that was sort of like, wasn't part of the interview process. And it's something that we felt very grateful to, is that generosity. But again, there was the intimacy is not a commodity that could just be like projected and taken away. And so that was something that we were wanted to be very clear about in terms of like how the film was produced. But like, full disclosure, in a lot of ways, I think of this film as a failure, right? Because I think when we went to film Grace Period, there was so much urgency, right, to like have this film be put out as quickly as possible to support the women's cause, right? But I'm not a documentarian in that way. I'm not an activist filmmaker in that way. And so we tried to explain very carefully about like how it wasn't about sort of fighting a cause in the moment, right? Like, and as we tried to support them in as many ways as possible. And they in turn like allowed us to use some of their archival documentation, which we employed a lot in Grace Period. And like, we were thinking very carefully about how to present the film, right? And present this to an audience. But it didn't align with this sort of activist filmmaking style, like getting it out, having people be aware, let's like call our council person and like create political pressure. It wasn't a film in that manner, right? And so and in that way, like, I think we failed them, because I would have loved to have made the film that they wanted us to make, but that was not possible. Like, their desire and their needs were very different from like the concerns we had in terms of like a more invisible discourse, right? In terms of like how these images proliferate and how the ideas of like normalcy and transparency and that violence sort of proliferate. Like, when we finished, which again was like 4 years after the fact, after we shot it, we spent about 8 months documenting it and then another 3 years editing it. And part of it was that my co-director, Kyung-wook, he was actually in prison during this time because he was a conscientious objector to the Korea's like mandatory military service for all men between like ages 19 to 29, I believe. And so that slowed things down. Like, we gave the film back to the women as best as we could, but because of the precarity of their work, a lot of these women were no longer in the brothel space where we originally documented the film. There's a transience that occurs with this type of labor. And so a lot of the women are not to be found any longer. And so that kind of heightens the need to like create sort of security precautions around protecting their identities, because like we can't get it back to them in that way.
I think that what's so interesting is something that I was sort of planning to kind of pose as a question or a reflection to you both, was about your relationships to nonfiction documentary sort of practices, and obviously kind of most directly with Grace Period for you, Caroline. But I talk about in the program notes about how I feel that you managed to really resist this humanitarian impulse within Grace Period. And this is something that I've been really thinking through. And I don't know if either of you are familiar with Pooja Rangan's scholarship, but she came out with this book a few years ago called Immediations, and it's really about this. It's really about critiquing and troubling the humanitarian impulse within the documentary practice historically, right? There was such a way, Caroline, that you and Kyungmook were able to convey the gravity of the precarity of these women's situation, while also kind of drawing us away from viewing the work, as a sort of aim for like humanitarian aid, right? And how there were so many other things visually and formally, and also just interpersonal relationships that really shaped what we see as the film itself. So I just wanted to kind of reflect that back to you. But yeah, I guess I was just curious about if either of you wanted to share a little bit more about how working in this mode of nonfiction, or, I know that both of your works have also shown in sort of more documentary kinds of spaces, and how you sort of conceive of your practice within that larger practice, I guess.
I don't know if this like directly addresses what you like everything that you brought up, but because the whole time I actually heard Vika's voice in my head, like the final line of like rats leaving a sinking ship of like, fuck you world, I owe you nothing, right? And I was just thinking about in terms of nonfiction, and when it's a subject that is like that I am a stranger to, right? That I am outside of, right? Like it's not me telling my own experience, that is a sentiment that is really important to keep in mind, that like the women in Grace Period, right? Like they owe me nothing. They owe this audience of the film nothing, right? Like they put themselves out there with these amazing protests that they did. They offered their like stories, right? And it's theirs, right? That this is their agency. And like, I can try to respect that as best as possible. But like, honestly, like I can't hold an expectation of them, right? And like and neither can the audience. And that's something that I try to think. And I think that sentiment, Vika, in your film is like a really, really perfect sort of like expression of that, because like this is your story, right? Like with like rats leaving a sinking ship, that is something that you like chose and give freely, but also freely withhold as you see necessary, right? And like you kind of perfectly encapsulate it in that final line of like, how much can we actually take away from this moment, right? Like how much should we take away from this moment, and how to respect that it is still your experience and your work, right? Like as told through your work. And that I think that is like unexpectedly has like helped me sort of create a lens around nonfiction or thinking about nonfiction. Like I never think of myself as making documentary work. I think of myself as making nonfiction work, which actually contains so much more than documentary and the expectations of documentary.
I think I agree with you. I would also prefer terms like nonfiction rather than documentary. And I think coming back to your question, Leeroy, I think this is some of the core problem that I've been working with, especially when using the biographical as material, as a resource, often as in like Rats Leaving a Sinking Ship, that is a way of feeling more active in something that is otherwise overwhelming. So whenever I make something material, like I use it as a resource, I kind of like, I feel more active in the process of a situation that is not only pleasurable, that is violent at the same time. The biographical as a resource is producing like as kind of documentary material produces many problems if I depend on this as an artist, because it's very vulnerable, but also like depending on vulnerability as a resource within like a capitalist market is not necessarily like an overlapping between life and work that is desirable. And also adding onto that, the problems of like experiencing difference, of the problems of like different forms of dictatorship, that has kind of like shaped my practice kind of over the course of the works that we're showing, because like Rat's Leading Thinking Ship was relatively well received. Like it showed a lot, it won prizes, it suddenly pushed myself more into the art world, also from kind of film and video festival world. So a lot of people saw it, and a lot of people seemed to relate to it. And I was a bit suspicious of like what that meant, that
Right.
people were so into this.
Totally.
And especially like the experience of being, for example, at a film festival, at exhibitions, I spend less time with people who see the work, but at film festivals, it's strange how much someone could like watching kind of that set of trouble or difficulties or problems that are not their own, while struggling tremendously at being respectful, like person to person, in like a social situation, of like how attractive this difference was on screen, but how much some people struggled to respectfully engage with that difference, like on a social, personal, situational level.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Which then kind of made me do work for many years that was kind of addressing the spectator, that was like talking to them directly, that is trying to destabilize their position, that is trying to make them feel looked back at,
Mm-hmm.
kind of to break that unilateral stare, to not let them cast unmet gazes. But then in the end, just to paraphrase my problem, that was kind of my reaction to like the biographical, autobiographical, and documentary image that can be looked at. And why I was like so busy kind of looking back at that and like countering that way of like perceiving and experiencing documentary or images of bodies, for that matter. To only then realize that in doing that, I'm also like centering kind of the problem with critique I have in general, that critique is parasitic, or it is very dependent on its object of critique, that it often ends up centering. So when I do critical work about the way people can look at my body or at my life on a screen, I center an imagined audience that might not be the audience I care most about, which is then the reason why in Untitled Sequence of Gaps, that was like for the first time in many years, the first work I did again of trying to layer and structure and think about images and violence and visibility and violence in a way that was not centering such like a viewer in possession of a more privileged or mainstream positionality. So yeah, that is like a long-winded answer to how that brought the question you posed. How my practice was actively and passively shaped by that.
Yeah, that really, I can see that very much in the sort of breadth of your work over time. And something that really has like struck me in our conversation, but also things that I'm interested in or have a lot of curiosity around, that also sort of brought the works together, is really examining this very kind of popular notion, I guess, right, that we must see suffering or that we must see violence in order to know it exists. And I think both
we
of
can
you
see violence.
That we can, exactly. And that even the possibility of that visuality of suffering and violence, right, that then gives evidence for its existence, right? And this is clearly something that you directly address, Vika, in your new film, in Untitled Sequence of Gaps, and also, I would say, in both of your practices with you, Caroline, as well, about this kind of, also not new, but sort of this kind of renewed, right, kind of sense of obsession, I would say, and real fixation, right, and demand for that level of transparency, right, and that transparency, or even asserting the notion that that transparency actually exists, right, in a visual form. And so, I'm really thinking a lot about, how this notion of seeing and calculating violence or suffering really plays out when, when the subject of the sort of marginalized subject, right, is involved, right? And how then, the need to sort of see these subjects in a particular light or in a particular manner to represent then, those conditions of marginalization, right? So it becomes transfixed then onto the body, onto the individuated self, right? Or these ideas of otherness or difference within a more, individuated way, rather than a societal issue, an institutional issue, right? Like larger kinds of histories that have obviously shaped that condition, right? So it's kind of more like centering these subjects and moments and mediums in which things can be captured, right? And I'm really interested in how these different conditions of marginalization then also become a device, right? Within, broadly speaking, art and film and video work that then is about becoming a device for a means of identification with the viewer, this kind of sense of relatability or empathy or sympathy, right? These different kinds of emotional responses that this work is trying to evoke from the viewer, right, for a certain purpose. And, I think that that's just an ongoing thing that I'm interested in and exploring, and very much see in both of your works. And, like, for example, like a very concrete example I would say is just like this rise in conversation around what I feel like, around what is the value or purpose, right, of seeing footage after footage of Black suffering and death, right? And how does that, the visuality of that is as a means to quantify that anti-Black racism exists, right? And its many manifestations, and how that impacts Black communities and individuals in very material ways, right? And so I feel like this is a discourse that is really being talked about, and is an extension of this kind of larger thing that we're talking about here, about what it means to demand the visualization of suffering or death from a marginal subject in particular. And what I really appreciate about both of your works is that you are asserting a refusal to that kind of visuality, right? But also by obscuring or rendering the images, it's really allowing a space for people to then kind of the sort of the spirit of the program series, what we imagine in its absence, right? Like to ask of the viewer then to imagine what the possibilities, right, of understanding or comprehension, or their lack of, or the impossibility of that, right, when a visual absence is in place.
Thinking about visuality is like a crazy obsession, which I guess if you work in the visual medium, you just have to be just obsessive about and neurotic about what visibility means, and like the need for visibility, and like what is it a marker for, right? So like you pointing out the difficulties of and the fraught space of, like, for instance, anti-Black violence, right? As in particular inflicted by police upon Black, usually male, but not strictly male bodies, right? And how there is this sort of need for that suffering and those markers of suffering. But when you become obsessive about thinking about what that image is, right? And like how it proliferates, it becomes a marker for everything that isn't captured on film, isn't captured on camera, right? That like you become very aware of its limitations and its contours, right? And jumping around a little bit, and I'm like thinking about going from grace period and sort of thinking about withholding the visibility, like the markers of suffering or of sexual desire upon a sex worker's body, right? Like through these silhouettes. To Cora, so for context, I was working on Cora. I worked on Cora as a result of working at a hospital as a medical videographer. My job was to film surgeries for an OBGYN department of a major teaching hospital in New York City. And I took that job as a way to finance completing grace period, right? So there was this like weird continuation of like thinking about women and thinking about like how women are regarded by larger institutions, from the government to medicine, right? And everything that medicine encompasses. And as I finished grace period, like at the same time, I was just becoming incredibly uncomfortable with the job that allowed me to complete grace period because of that sort of fraughtness of the imagery I was producing for this hospital, right? Of women undergoing very sensitive procedures at a very vulnerable time in their lives, and thinking about how this material was being used by the medical institution, right, to like sort of bolster their reputation, to further the career of the various doctors and like students who asked for this material, supposedly for like very altruistic purposes of like furthering medical education. It was supposed to train young residents to become better surgeons, right? By like watching the procedures of these doctors who are like incredible at what they do, right? And there were these instances where I just recognized that there's this huge framework of consent, of gathering consent from patients to film their bodies, to film them undergoing these procedures. And then like this imagery becomes the property of that institution, right? To like, for various purposes. And as someone employed by the institution, there was a moment, weird. I've never actually told this story beyond like very close circles, but like I guess I'm sharing it with the speculative LA Film Forum public. There was a moment where I filmed a procedure at the request of a doctor, and it was a woman who was undergoing the procedure. She was anesthetized. There was an endoscopic camera being inserted into her, right? And she woke up during the procedure, right? And apparently this is not, sorry, I'm going into like weird medical horror stories and I don't intend to, but this point is that she felt the pain, her body felt the pain, and she was sort of like waking up to the procedure, and they like responded to it, right? And they restrained her, and they like increased the dosage of the anesthesia and continued the procedure. But like as I was filming it, it was incredibly uncomfortable, obviously. And this is not to center my experience of filming it, but like what I recognized was that the doctor was saying, I did this procedure correctly, right? And on film, as somebody who's not trained in medicine, somebody who was witnessing this, it looked like he was using excessive force, right? It looked like he was inflicting violence upon this body. And we see this, and then there's this woman who is responding to that. And I can't know, right? Like we have this video documentation, but like, I don't know what appropriate force is, right? Like, I don't know. And like, he claims that he did not use he did not use excessive force, right? And like, you can't actually see from the visual evidence, like how much force he exerts onto the body, right? Like you can't actually see it. You just see like the actions of pressure being put upon a body, but you don't know how much force is being impacted on the body. And this woman will have no memory of it. She will wake up from anesthesia, not remembering anything, not knowing anything that occurred to her in that moment. And we have this visual record, right? Which looks one way, but we can't actually know, right? Like I don't know if I'm telling this story in a way that kind of conveys the horror and also the complications of like how like you can't actually register touch and the haptic and like actual intimacy on the visual record. Like it becomes an indicator of it, but it's not real evidence. Like you can't have a measure of like how much pressure is put on a body or like what that touch looks like. And that's what spurred Cora, was like thinking about like consent of the use of this imagery, how it was read within these larger frameworks to define like the idea of like what a woman is supposed to be, like what a normal person is supposed to be, right? And how closely aligned that was to like the government imposing upon like its civilian population, like what a productive citizen is, right? Like what who an illegal person is, right? Like who a legal person is, like making these parameters so clear, right? And that visual evidence being used was a central part of that. That visuality was a central part of that.
Yeah.
So they're very closely related, and thinking about trying to not recreate that violence, not to sensationalize it, but to sort of like make clear the apparatus of visuality of the camera. Like that was something that I'm obsessively thinking about and losing sleep about as a filmmaker, like all the time.
Yeah. Yeah. Vika, is there anything you wanted to add? Or
as much as I'm concerned with opacity or the right to opacity, and like rats, that is more in a Glissanthian sense, like excessive use of or the violence of transparency. Also, as Caroline mentioned, kind of like a lot of my work, it's like just showing so much transparency and like privileged gazes and all of this. And Untitled Sequence of Gaps is maybe just to say like Glissant is never like using opacity as like a goal or like something to aspire to, but a right to something one should possess, like, or especially marginalized people should possess the right not to be understood. And I think the opacity that I discuss in Untitled is of a very different nature, and it's memory loss. I also like to kind of tie this back to that violence incident that Carolyn, you were just describing, and violence in images. And while in what you just described, the image was somewhat, or imaging techniques were entangled or like implicated within something that was potentially violent, but could not serve as an evidence to provide testimony to that violence. What I try to do in Untitled Sequence of Gaps is kind of starting from there being no images, and kind of questioning the relation we often place between violence and visibility. Just the basic assumption that violence is something that can be seen. And I think especially in terms of moving image or documentary images and the debates and conversations that we've been having for many decades on violence and images. And despite there being decades of conversations on structural violence, it's still one that assumes that violence can be seen in an image that is knowable, that is seeable. And I think certain kinds of violence are, and other kinds of violence aren't. And perhaps some violences can be perceived from certain perspectives or subject positions, or by those who are on the receiving end of that violence, but cannot be seen from other positions. And I think that is something that I've been thinking about also in using like ultraviolet light and infrared, of like how we try to translate things we cannot necessarily see from where we stand into that normative frame of the moving image. of like trying to use technology to translate something into the spectrum that we can perceive. But that doesn't change the fact that there are things outside of what we can see from where we stand that we just can't see. And violence exists beyond of that what we can see if it addresses us personally in terms of trauma or memory loss. There might be violence beyond the visible spectrum that we cannot use images as evidence. We cannot prove anything with them. And also on the other side, from where we stand, we might not see the violence as it is perpetuated and felt and as it strikes other people. And I think this is kind of like what I'm thinking about now, or like I continue to think about now, is how to work with that in moving images, how to think of this differently, how to like develop practices that work with images differently, that don't kind of depart from that basic assumption. Because also like another thought on violence and visibility is that the more privilege a person has, or like the more central their subject position is in the hierarchy of like how societies are built, the more privilege someone has, the more possibilities they often have to be violent but not leave traces behind, to kind of perpetuate invisibilized violence. And something I've been thinking about because I've been thinking a lot about gentrification and tenants' rights and the violence of someone who is a real estate agent, who unhouses people, who does not give housing to certain populations, extremely violent with extremely intimate effects on people, but without an image that could provide evidence to that violence. And it's often not like hierarchized types of violences, but there are types of violence that can be seen from all perspectives. And there are types of violences like that that cannot. And I think, similarly with trauma. So, just to come back to your question, Untitled Sequence of Gaps and Like Rats work with opacities in very different ways in the end. Although formally there are some similarities, but I think in terms of content, there are big differences between that forced transparency that produces its own story. Basically, the biography that is laid out in the psychiatric reports is basically saying what that gaze wants to see and is able to see. It's not showing or testifying anything outside of that. An Untitled Sequence of Gaps is more concerned with centering the gap, the space in between the images, as there and present, and kind of using those opacities as spaces for potentials, for presence of things that cannot be shown in the medium we chose to work with, but are still there and can be felt, perhaps.
That description of that sort of interstitial opacities in Untitled Sequence of Events, it so perfectly lays out what I was hoping for in Cora, and that's why I named the film Cora, because Cora actually refers to this sort of interstitial, non-being space of potentiality, right? It's like it's an ancient Greek term for, and it's like often thought of as like a corollary to a womb-like space, but it's not. It becomes like a speculative space, a space of unknowability, and that refuses this sort of like defining and transparency, right? And I was thinking about, like, I named Cora that because I thought it was so impossible to capture that within visuality with like medical footage and thinking about the medical apparatus. And so I was hoping to like try to evoke it somehow, at least through the title, almost like a spell being cast, right? And Untitled sequence of events definitely, like, it somehow gets closer to it, I think. And I love that it gets sort of closer to that space without actually laying out that space, right? It like kind of hints at what we can't know, what we should, and questions whether we have a right to know it and who it belongs to, if it is something that is like tangible and can be owned and like contained in that way. Before I forget, I was hoping, Vika, I can ask you a question. And it's
Yes.
like, sorry to like pivot the conversation a little bit, but like
No, please.
I was thinking about like the autobiographical nature of like Untitled Sequence of Events and like Rats Leaving a Sinking Ship. But then I was thinking about how you are very deliberately conveying somebody else's presence, somebody else's existence, somebody else's identity and positionality through Welcome Address, right? And like through the institution of this museum. And I so thoroughly, like I feel weird saying it because it's like I want to honor it as like an art piece and like understand and like the conceptual framework of it, but like I was entertained by that piece, right? And I was just uncomfortable by that piece, with that piece of thinking of like presenting one's identity, right? Like actually being very like having ownership of visuality in this very specific way, thinking about the framework of it as currency within like the institution of art, right? And I felt so uncomfortable as the viewer, right? And as like potentially the intended viewer, like not in that museum space, but as like someone, as a cultural practitioner, as somebody within this sphere. And I think I was also entertained because I got the sense that you and that curator had a lot of fun with this and we're like so hyper aware of it. And we're like able to sort of like play with one another and each other's roles as like the creator of this filmmaker, creator of this film, as the curator of this show, as this body for self-presentation, and like also playing upon the expectations of a viewer to just like easily digest and consume all of this that's being contained within the frame, right? And like you deny it, but you also kind of like play in this way that's so creative and like so clever. And I was hoping that you can talk about that film a little bit because it does feel very related to the autobiographical works, right? But it's also very like there's a sort of weird joy a little bit, but it's sort of like a wink and a smirk almost. And maybe I'm misinterpreting or maybe I'm like projecting onto it, but yeah.
No, that's totally right. Thank you for your question. That piece was produced particularly for that exhibition, and as it is kind of mentioned within the video itself, as that the institution had like an open call for a researcher to come in to look at their collection from like a post-colonial perspective and look at their cellar basically. And the expectation obviously having to be that there are problems with the collection, otherwise they wouldn't do this. Ashkan then applied for that exhibition, for that position, and got that position, which was a paid position for 1.5 years that was leading up to that exhibition and publication project. And Ashkan invited me to be part of that exhibition that featured a number of contemporary artists or people working in contemporary art to do something else, because Ashkan was not so happy with just being outsourced and tasked that job as a person of color to come into the institution, look at their shit and say, yes, you're racist, which basically they should know already. And just to do this work on their behalf was not really interesting to him. So when he invited me to be part of the exhibition, we just met and talked a few times, and I realized that we talked a lot about him being in that institution as, I think at that point, the only person being there permanently was not white. And it also becoming clear that through him and his biography and his knowledge and educational capital also, the institution would reach artists and audiences that they could not reach themselves. So basically through his person and professional network, the institution was able to reach audience they wouldn't otherwise reach. So like he became a proxy of something, and also his identity was obviously kind of commodified in it, but he was also entangled in that. So in dialogue with Ashkan, we kind of figured it, or like I had the idea that it would be interesting to use parts of the funding application that the museum had written to get the funding for that position and exhibition project, along with Ashkan's own application for that position, some of the writing of the institution of how they describe themselves on their website, and some additional lines by me. And so that was very much made in dialogue with Ashkan, and there were different points of like also hesitation and kind of us talking about different ways the script, directions the script could go. And what is important for me is that it still showed me as a person also implicated in that violence. Because there was a version of the script that Ashkan suggested at one point that would have been much, much, much closer to what he wanted to be doing with this exhibition, much closer to his intentions, that would have kind of erased my problematic presence in that. So if it had just been like a kind of an honest, more accurate introduction to into the exhibition, I think this would have kind of let me off the hook much more than it should have, as someone being placed in the position to be invited to participate in that exhibition and to produce a new work for it. And I did not feel that I could produce something other than kind of showing what was happening there in that whole process of like that exhibition and the institution's ideas and how we became implicated with our different identities. Because as much as Ashkan's identity as someone who is not, as a person, as a brown person of color, and researcher with a lot of educational capital, I also ticked some boxes that the museum felt they had to tick, and that Ashkan also felt he had to tick in terms of like assembling a diverse roster of artists. So in the end, it was kind of about that. And yeah, you're right, Caroline. Like Ashkan and I had a lot of fun working on it, but it was also brave of Ashkan. Like it was not. It's uncomfortable to be sharing one's own application to then be turned into part of the speech of the script that I then collaged for him. So yeah.
I don't know whose decision it was to include the lyrics of that Enya song, Sail Away, but it was so perfect because it was just like, oh yeah, everything is being treated almost like a destination, right? Like this museum is a destination to honor like gay, but now like much more expansive LGBTQI
Exactly.
like identity, right? And then like Ashkan's own identity as this sort of like destination as well, like Cebu and like Tripoli and all these places that are listed in that song. And thus, but it's how pervasive it is, right? Like that song was everywhere. I remember when I was like 13 years old, right? And it's not, it actually does kind of reflect a violent mentality of like how things are registered as this sort of leisurely commodified thing that you can like easily so casually possess or casually visit or casually experience and like incorporate as and claim for yourself, right?
Mm-hmm.
And that's it. It feels a lot like the analogy you made earlier about like the real estate agent, right? Like the real estate agent doesn't think that he or she is inflicting violence through gentrification. They think they're doing a job, right? It's so normalized, it's so prolific and prevalent and like invisible in that way, right? And like, but once again, like it kind of points to the limits of like what we can see and understand through that one piece of evidence that I so appreciate. And I also found really funny in that moment. It's an Enya song. Like I love that you incorporated an Enya song for what it's worth.
Yeah, I also think like that was Ashkan's idea, by the way, and I think it made total sense as well, because we're talking a lot about what it means to exhibit and where exhibiting comes from, or what it also did. I mean, especially in a European colonial context, and what are collections? European collections are mostly not the Gay Museum. It's not really what you imagine as a collection, and like museum collection is really just mostly stuff that people give to the museum when they die. So it's not like a huge museum collection, but like most museum collections in Europe are just stolen colonial artifacts. That's what they are. So then for there to be a museum where one exhibits oneself, or like a broadening self, that like gathers around the gay and cis roots of that institution. What does it mean to exhibit? What is that gesture? Is it better if one exhibits oneself? Somehow is one exhibited as a curator also in the context of that show? Who is doing what work, and is exhibiting itself kind of a continuation of a colonial self-understanding mentality and psyche? I think these were some of the things we're discussing and trying to then incorporate into the show in terms of like how Ashkan formed like the overarching narrative of the show, and me with what I contributed to that exhibition.
Yeah, I think that piece is so interesting, and how it's also dealing with this issue of transparency in a different way, right? And to put one's private information that's not intended for the public or beyond, institutional walls, so to say, is being put on display. And Caroline, you said this word currency, which definitely came to mind as well, in kind of a lot of different contexts here. So like, as we are all very cognizant of this like increasing rise of, arts and cultural institutions really looking to, bring in diverse members, particularly folks of color, to examine their collections and to create work from that, and the currency that comes with for those institutions, back to those institutions, right, versus the individuals themselves, right, or their communities. And so I felt it was such an interesting and also kind of satirical way also to like pose kind of back right at the institution and put it on display as just sort of their inner workings of their decisions and intentions even, right, for bringing Ashkan into this project and all that kind of stuff.
It's also it is complex, of course, but I think, white supremacy is a white problem, and colonialism is a problem caused by white people. Then why do then like people of color have to come in to clean it up within the institutions? Of course it's good if like positions are created and paid, but it is like a white colonial self-understanding to feel like we've been somewhat implicated in our positionalities in a long hundreds and hundreds of years history of something. And then now we can pay somebody like for 1.5 years and explain it to us in a way where we don't have to do this work for 1.5 years ourselves, to look at like what's been problematic about the institutions that were built around certain ideas and understandings.
Right. And I think that, what you're saying too, of like, oh, that's great, to have, institutions create these like paid positions for people to come and do work and whatnot. But then it's also this question of, one, the sort of precarity that's implicated in those positions, which are often temporary positions, part-time positions, right? Unstable positions that are not actually about providing more sustenance as in a durational measure for someone to continue on doing their work that they've, gotten education and training around, and that is a part of their practice. It's not about cultivating the practice, it's about extracting components of the practice for the institutional's benefit, right? And, it also is speaking to also when folks are brought in, let's say even in a permanent capacity, the expectations then on folks, particularly of color, to then deliver very kind of narrow, right, scope of work that they see as lacking or underrepresented, right, or areas that need to be excavated further. And so there's also those right dynamics that are built into a lot of those positions and those invitations into, right, the institution. So yeah, it's I feel like that piece is really kind of exposing, maybe, that's another word of thinking about it, rather than transparent or along with transparent, but more of an exposure to, right, the intentions, right, and reflecting that back to the institution and its, general base that would attend an exhibition like that, right? So I find that really, really interesting. I think that we're probably good to wrap up, unless you wanted to pose something more, or if there's anything else you wanted to follow up on.
I'm just really happy to be doing this. Like, this has been so great. And I also feel, I just want to say what I've been saying like the past few weeks, is that like, I can't believe I haven't seen your work prior to this. And I'm like really, Vika, and I'm like really great. I'm like really grateful that it's happened at long last, like, so again, thank you, Leeroy. Like, this wouldn't have happened under any other circumstance. And it's like, I just need to like express how appreciative I am about that.
Yeah, same for me. It's been such a pleasure. And like from the beginning, I knew that if you had in mind to do this kind of setup of bringing the two of us into conversation with each other, because you saw something in our practices that was kind of asking for that conversation to happen. I'm really grateful to you, Leeroy. I'm grateful for the opportunity to having been able to talk to both of you today, but also last week in preparation, and all the emails in advance, and getting to know your work, Caroline, and also seeing your work through Leeroy's eyes a little bit, which I also think is really nice, because I got introduced to your work through Leeroy, who I trust so much, and his sensibilities and political readings of work. And so I could also kind of see it through conversations that I've had with Leeroy independently from your work, and access it in that way, which is a really beautiful way of like approaching and getting in contact with your work. So yeah, it's been really, really beautiful, and I'm really grateful for my work to be shown in this context. And
I think for all this talk about visibility, this is like the best way to be seen. So thank you both, Vika and Leeroy.
Yeah, thank you both for your time. And yeah, it's been such a lovely experience.
I can't say enough how happy I am to bring you both together and to make this connection happen. And I feel that I've been working very much alongside both of you, and it just only seemed appropriate to bring you both together. And I appreciate so much your generosity also in your time, and in having this conversation and sharing with me so much with your works, and allowing me to be able to present it and write about it in this way. So thank you so much. And, we hope that folks have been able to tune in out there, and please get in touch with, I guess, LA Film Forum. If anybody does have any questions or comments they want to share about the programs, I'd be happy to respond to those, or also pass them along to Caroline and Vika. So thank you so much, and we'll see you again, hopefully soon.
Thank you. Bye.
Bye.